We have, how about now? We have another full day programming here, and I'm very, very happy to start things off with a panel on what I call after the ceasefire, and which when we designed this panel, there was still a ceasefire, but few of us thought that it would last until April, and sure enough, it didn't. One of the things I'd like to focus on the panel is accountability. I think that's could be a sort of a window or a wedge into talking about all kinds of issues in terms of responses to the ongoing atrocity situation in Gaza. And before I introduce our great panelists here, I was at my beloved Chris's diner this morning, having my eggs and reading on my phone. And you probably read the same thing that I did in the Times, that 15 emergency service workers in Gaza who were driving a series of ambulances in a fire truck. This was 2 weeks ago. Wearing insignia of the Red Crescent were fired upon by Israeli troops 2 weeks ago and massacred. Their bodies were buried in a mass grave. The denial of any wrongdoing by the IDF has now been undermined by the recovery of a cell phone from the grave, which shows the last moments of a man's life as he is trying to escape from his ambulance and failing. So the question of accountability is generally, I think, one that we think about, and we can talk about this too, in terms of those most responsible. And we could think, for example, about the ICC's decision to indict Benjamin Netanyahu, along with his former defense minister and several now deceased members of the Hamas leadership. But I think we often think of we often think of the situation in Gaza as a war. We talk about the war in Gaza, when in fact it seems more and more clear that an atrocity prevention lens will clarify that there is a massive accountability shortfall and massive accountability problem in the wake of extraordinary atrocities that have been committed, certainly by Hamas on October 7th, 2023, but by the Israeli military in particular. The panel I'd like to have today is not a conversation about how to get to peace in Gaza. We can talk about that, absolutely. But it's a question about how accountability mechanisms for atrocity crimes have a prevention role to play, or in this case, whether they have a prevention role to play. And as usual, I've not really given our panelists much in the way of instruction about how to talk about this or how to think about this. I'm framing the question to experts with a lot to say, I think, about the situation and see what they want to talk about. So let me very briefly introduce our panelists. Beginning on your far right is Leila Hilal, who is the former director of the Middle East Task Force at New America. She focuses on Syria, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and issues related to U.S. foreign policy, community-based change, constitution-making, and transitional justice in the broader Middle East and North Africa. She served as senior policy advisor to the Commissioner General of the Palestinian Refugee Agency on UNRWA, and as legal advisor to Palestinian negotiators from 2002 to 2008. Her credentials go on and on. She's I'm going to skip over a lot. I mean, all of you are like this, but next we'll introduce Nancy Okail, who is a scholar, policy analyst, and advocate with more than 20 years of experience working on issues of human rights, democracy, and security in the Middle East. She's been a visiting scholar at the Center for Democracy Development and Rule of Law at Stanford. Before coming to the United States, she worked on, managed, and evaluated foreign aid programs for several international organizations, including the World Bank and the United Nations Development Program. Let me please also introduce Sarah Lee Whitson, who is the executive director at Dawn. And can you remind us what that acronym stands for?
Well, it used to stand for Democracy for the Arab World now, but we're not using that.
Okay, I'm sorry. Pardon me. Previously, she served as executive director of Human Rights Watch's Middle East and North Africa division, overseeing the work of the division in 19 countries. She's led dozens of missions throughout the region, focusing on issues of armed conflict, accountability, legal reform, migrant workers, human rights. She's published widely on human rights and foreign policy in the Middle East and international and regional media. Robbie Damelin, he needs no introduction. We introduced our wonderful colleague yesterday from Parent Circle Families Forum, an Israeli-Palestinian organization that has been operating for over 35 years now to try to bring together Palestinian Israeli families who have lost loved ones in the ongoing conflict. So maybe I can just start things off by with this. I mean, it seems to me a very hard question because I just don't know how I would answer it. But the drive for accountability in the Gaza conflict seems to be almost non-existent. And there are all kinds of very obvious reasons for that. And so one of the questions that I have for you is, from your point of view of understanding the arc of this conflict, I mean, however long it's going to be, is accountability just going to be taking a back seat to trying to work instead on stopping violence against civilians in Gaza? Is accountability something that we should worry about later as a sort of a sequence of transitional justice that will we'll have to get to when we can? And I ask that question, I think, especially given what we heard yesterday about Sudan and about how the argument, which I think was a pretty sound one, that a huge contribution to the repetition of genocide in the Darfur region from 2005 to 2025 was the utter lack of accountability and the insistence on seeing it as a conflict rather than as a crime. And so maybe I could ask Leila to start us off and just share your views about that. Thank you.
This mic, yeah. So I think it's really great that this is where you start. I think accountability is the urgent question for Palestinians and Israelis. I no longer use the term conflict. I missed the Sudan panel, but it sounds like where the discussion ended is, the same where we might end today. And accountability more widely, I think, is the big issue for the world as we see what's happening in the U.S. and the general trend towards authoritarianism and fascism. So it's a big issue. I think, and there's a lot to discuss because accountability mechanisms have very uniquely in the context of the past year and a half been mobilized where they haven't been before for Israeli war crimes and mass atrocities. So there's a lot to discuss. But where I want to start is with the question, the last question you asked, Max, yesterday, regarding, is there anything else we need to understand? And I think we just need to think a little bit about the context before we jump into the full discussion. And I want to say that, the accountability issue reaches back almost 100 years when there was the effort when the British handed Mandate Palestine.
Always the British.
we can't forget the colonial right? The responsibility and accountability of the colonial powers. And then you had the mass displacement of Palestinians, 2/3 of the Palestinian population, at a time when Jewish residents were made up of 4% of the land of Mandate Palestine. And their displacement was not to faraway places, but to Gaza, to West Bank, to the surrounding region. But they were denied the right to return and continue to be. And there are Palestinians inside what is now Israel. There are Palestinians in Gaza, and there are Palestinians in the West Bank. And Gaza and the West Bank are occupied territories. The people that live there are stateless, and many Palestinians in the diaspora remain stateless. And there are war crimes being committed. There are mass atrocities and human rights violations being committed against Palestinians wherever they are. And this includes Gaza and it includes the West Bank. Now, the situation is extremely, there's a extreme crisis of accountability inside Gaza with the bombing and the mass starvation. And we have had the genocide case at the ICJ with the finding of the plausibility that genocide is being committed. But we have to understand that what is at issue is not a people-to-people problem. It's important for Israelis and Palestinians to have contact and conversation and build understanding, right? And as someone that worked a lot on transitional justice, I have a very, I believe that Israeli fear of, of what they have done as a country to Palestinians plays a large part in the build-up to what we're seeing today. And I don't think Palestinians have been able they haven't been able to recognize that for many reasons. So I think that's how I have long understood the context and seen that as an important element for moving towards peace. But there is a very specific problem we're facing right now, which is the Israeli public, not just the leaders, but the public, are very extremist. And this is very, it's not, we've seen the videos of soldiers who've gone into Gaza and the way that they are debasing and dehumanizing Palestinians. We've had Israeli leaders say, all Palestinians are Hamas and should be killed. There is a policy of mass starvation going on. That stems from genocidal intent, and for a society to be able to support that, quite frankly, I would say is an extremist society. So I think the question of accountability becomes very complex in the current situation. But because mechanisms have been mobilized, we have to think about what they can do now and focus on that. But I think at the heart of the issue is a question of settler colonialism, the role of Zionism in creating a context where Jewish supremacy is the framework in which this extremism has been allowed to be cultivated. And the fact that there is a system of control, like physical control around Gaza and around communities in the West Bank that Israelis are not able to penetrate or mostly, for most part, not willing to penetrate. So the separation of the people is contributing to the extremism and the dehumanization that we're seeing. on the part of the Israeli public and leadership. And I think we have to really think about dismantling ideologies that prevent societies such as the Israeli society to even ask that their leaders be held accountable. And then, of course, there's the issue of the US, which I'm not going to take on because I've spoken enough.
First of all, thank you so much for coordinating this amazing conference. And for us coming from DC, it's very lonely there. It's been very lonely, and to feel that you are with a community.
We like to think of this as the spa weekend.
It really means a lot because it's, and when I say it's becoming lonely in DC, I'm not talking about just I would like to make a disclaimer.
Can you hear that?
Can you hear me? Okay, this is better. Okay. So I want to make a disclaimer before I start talking so that nothing gets confused and lost in what I'm going to say. No one could or should underestimate the danger of having a president like Trump in the White House. I mean, this is on so many levels, dismantling the foundations of democracy and everything that comes with it. Having said that, and I just want to put this aside, none of this, and this I mean, is like the lack of accountability, the complicity, the enabling and abating of the United States to the war in Gaza has not started with Trump. It was enabled and supported materially by resources and by statements and messages from the Biden administration. So we need to be clear about that. We need to be clear also, I mean, because first of all, I mean, you're saying that accountability is taking the back seat. I don't remember ever it's taken a front seat in this conflict. And I don't want to go back to where Leila started like decades ago. I just want to start since after Hamas was in power. And it has been a recurring cycle that is many versions of what we are seeing now. And the reason why we are where today is the complete lack of accountability. I mean, if you remember in 2008, Operation Cast Lead, which was like, again, the conflict is like Israelis, at that time it was called conflict, and I like that Leila pointed out, that we can't refer to it as such. There was a fact-finding mission in the Goldstone report that was, very clear and documented, and then it would put us. And then this is what kept happening, the lack of accountability. Over the past years, I don't know, year and a half, I had many meetings at the White House and many meetings with state. And at the beginning, everything is we want to talk about what's happening now. No, we want to talk about the day after. It's just I keep saying, the day after will be determined by the terms upon which what happens now ends, if it does. So when we talk about accountability, there are several elements that has to be satisfied. Well, first of all, you have to have the mechanisms, the legislations, the laws, and they're there. They're there, international humanitarian law, international human rights law, U.S. laws, the Leila Hilal, which is supposed to be prohibiting the use of arms, that is from the United States to countries, and if it happens, it has to be stopped. In addition to this, overall existing mechanisms, there was also in 2024 what the MSN 20 made the mechanism, which was issued by President Biden. That is, which MSN is the mandate. I forgot the acronym because I hate it so much. That is like because it was a tool in order to make sure that if there are documentation that shows that there is a violation for human rights and humanitarian assistance and blocking and all those things, there should be a blocking of arms sales and security assistance to Israel or any country. I mean, like that is for that. And this brings me to the second element of accountability is access to information. As much as Israel has done a lot, I mean, just to intimidate the press, block, I mean, the news, I mean, there's no dearth of information about the level of violations that we're seeing, and they are documented by very credible organizations. I mean, that last incident that you mentioned with the cell phone, I mean, this is just one of thousands of documentation. So there is no dearth of like knowledge that this has happened. They knew that happened, and they did not stop the arms. I mean, like there was this brief period where they stopped the 2,000 pound bombs to Israel, and then they resumed it. And then you have to have institutions that is able to enforce, I mean, those laws. I mean, if we're talking about international institutions, the United States played a major role in weakening those institutions. Its role in the United Nations, the veto power that it's used at every time there was an attempt for a resolution to stop this. Second, I mean, its own, like violating its own laws and undermining also the ICC and the ICJ. And even just by statements, I mean, they did not reach the point of like Trump like sanctioning the ICC, but they made statements that undermined those institutions. And third is that thinking, but that by changing messaging, that they will change, I mean, reality on the ground. I mean, it's like a lot of times, like with all the criticism of the administration, we explain that this is enabling. Is that yeah, and they're responsible, but we change our messaging. We are mentioning Palestinians right now, recognizing it's like yeah, I mean, you're mentioning it, you're threatening. I mean, you're saying words, but your problem is not a messaging problem. Your problem is a policy problem. And when you say, I mean, like all like to the 11th hour, when Secretary of State Blinken and Secretary of Defense sent a letter to Israel, giving them 1 month deadline to allow humanitarian aid, or else. That was the first utterance of what or else, because everything else was a suggestion. And it's like, we don't like you to do that, but we're going to keep sending you the bombs by which you're going to kill thousands of civilians. And it like supposedly like comes to the point of who decides who's a civilian and who's not, and that's another issue. We can get to it in the discussion. So the laws are there, the mechanisms are there, the information is there, the power is there, but there's no political will, and that's the missing part. It's like there was no political will to actually be serious about those issues. Now, the last point I'm going to make about how difficult it is right now for accountability, and the other related point that this does not stop just with Israel, is the inclusion of technology and AI in the use of weapons. And I mean, some of you may have heard about like the different tools that technological tools that Israel's been using. I mean, it's like to identify targets. I mean, and they use one is called Gospel Lavender, and another one very creepily is called Where's Daddy? And this is where they identify. And just to give you a scale of what this means, I mean, it's like we call this is like the factory of mass destruction in a way, or mass killing. Before the war, Israel used to take a year to identify 50 targets. I mean, by targets, what they consider as terrorists. after the war was using gospel and lavender and where's daddy, they would identify 100 targets a day. And using gospel, for example, they would identify 37,000 targets. So the problem with that is like, again, the other last challenge to accountability is that for accountability to take place also, there should be someone responsible. The problem with AI is the identifying who's responsible, because when you're using this technology, it's very hard to trace it back to the same way of ordering, like as you are using like traditional kinetic weapons. So that element gets us, it could be related to just like a problem in coding. Now, the other last problem I'm going to say, by Israel using those systems, or people call it like safety critical systems, without due process and without accountability, now Israel can say that these weapons or these technologies are battle tested. We tested it and it's working, and now we can sell it. And this is what is happening, is that now Israel can sell those technologies, and it gets like exacerbates the problem to other countries. So the issue of accountability in Israel does not stop in Israel. Just as like when yesterday in the Sudan discussion, we were talking about how it's related to what was happening in Yemen. So, sorry, I stopped.
Thank you, Nancy. Three things. On accountability, accountability is critical, and accountability is a fight. And the reason it's such a fight is because that is the most important lever we have to punish and to deter. That is why these international institutions have been established. That is why the International Criminal Court exists when there is no alternative for accountability domestically. It is the only criminal court in the world, and in a case that has been pending since the examination and investigation was launched in 2018, well before October 7 and well before the ongoing genocide in Gaza. My organization has prioritized accountability in two principal ways. Number one, we have filed a 172-page submission to the court urging the prosecutor to prosecute President Biden, Secretary Blinken, and Secretary Austin for committing crimes that are identified in the Rome Statute as aiding and abetting and facilitating war crimes, crimes against humanity, genocide, murder, starvation, and a host of other crimes that are described in the statute. The reason why accountability is particularly important is because this is a particular example where there has never been accountability, because the world's greatest superpower, the United States, has ensured not only that there's no accountability for ongoing war crimes in Palestine, but has actually aided and abetted them. This is something that deeply, deeply implicates Americans, and for which we have a grave responsibility. We have also supported the International Court of Justice's case prosecuting Israel for genocide. Our organization was the first organization to convene and conclude that Israel was committing genocide. That conclusion was reached in December, before the ICJ's opinion was reached. And I thank the South Africans here for the leadership that the South African government is taking in bringing this case. I don't think it's an accident that people of the global South have been the leading advocates for justice in Palestine and international measures of accountability. Accountability is also important because it pertains to the survival of the rule of law, not just the survival of the rule of law around the world, but in our own country. And that is why my organization is suing the State Department for deliberately failing to enforce the laws that, if appropriately applied, as Congress has ordered the executive branch to do, would have prohibited military assistance to Israel, as Nancy was referring to. And we just got our first response from the State Department to this lawsuit, and I hope you'll all closely watch it. And I think that the reason why we have focused in this manner on America's role in aiding and abetting, America's role in attacking accountability measures to protect and defend and enable Israel to continue its genocide is not only because we want justice and freedom for Palestinians, not only because we want accountability for Israelis and a wish that it will deter them from committing further crimes, but also because we are in a battle to uphold the rule of law, to uphold the international mechanisms that exist for the benefit of anyone, for everyone. The reason why the United States is now working to destroy the International Criminal Court, the reason why Israel has been spying on the prosecutor and attempting to dismantle the International Criminal Court, the reason why Israel has passed a law making it a crime for Israelis to provide information to the court, the reason why President Trump has now issued an executive order effectively making it a crime for organizations like mine to share information with the International Criminal Court, is because they do not want to see justice for Palestinians. They do not want to see Israel held accountable, and they will destroy the International Criminal Court and deprive everyone in the whole planet from the benefits of the International Criminal Court if it means prosecuting Israel. But the reality is that if the court fails to prosecute Israel, if the court fails to ever hold accountable a single non-Black person, then the court itself will fail and will collapse. So it really is a test for international global justice. It's a test for international criminal court and the International Court of Justice. And it's a test for American rule of law. You know, what good are laws that say the US government will not provide military assistance to governments committing human rights abuses if that law is never applied towards Israel? So I think these accountability efforts are critical not only for Palestine, not only for Israel, but for the survival of accountability and justice for anyone and everyone around the world. And I think that we are beginning to understand that the threat of accountability for Israel, which comes in many forms, judicial accountability is one form, public accountability is another form, is so threatening to Israel that we are now seeing the dismantling of academic freedom in the United States. We're seeing an attack, an unprecedented attack on students in the United States with the complicity of universities, cowardly, craven universities that are prioritizing their dollars over their freedom, over their students, over their credibility, over their integrity. And all of this is happening overwhelmingly, primarily in order to stop accountability, stop the public accountability that American students have played such a global leadership role in. And for those of you who've been part of that here in the audience today, those are the students, I commend you for your courage. I commend you for speaking out. I commend you for refusing to accept the diktats of being silenced to talk about a crime of genocide. And really, I call on all organizations who are even remotely involved in atrocity prevention and crimes to stand out and speak on this issue clearly, to speak about the genocide that's happening in Gaza clearly, without hesitation and without fear. Because if you are being fearful, if you are succumbing to this environment, if you're trying to avoid the topic of Palestine, if you're trying to duck and cover, guess what? It's not going to work. They're going to come after you eventually because this is a Trojan horse that's going to be used to silence all of us on everything.
Thank you very much. I'd like to ask to have Robbie talk a little bit about what this issue looks like from the point of view of an Israeli. But just Robbie, if I may, to set this up, I mean, we've talked a lot about accountability mechanisms through global institutions, and in general, and the International Criminal Court in particular, and the extraordinary attacks on the court and its operations, both by the Netanyahu administration and now by both in the Trump 1 and the Trump 2. Which are certainly having their effect. At the same time, the court has and continues to receive a great deal of criticism for focusing almost exclusively on trust-feeding heads of state, where the whole question of what the deterrent effect will be on sitting heads of state is much more complicated. I want to return to something that Leila started off with, and talk about, and that Sarah Lee was just touching on now, which is forms of accountability that the Israeli government has to its own electorate. And that's, I think, not so much a legal issue as more of a political issue. And can you just walk us through a little bit about how things look from Israel to you on this issue?
No, can I just add something which is less known on the issue of accountability?
Okay. You can pass that over right now.
Just to add more context on this issue. There is a case pending at the ICC to prosecute individual Israeli soldiers. There's an organization that is following this, that filed the petition, and what they're utilizing are the social media of individual soldiers who have videotaped themselves in Gaza committing crimes and celebrating those crimes. And there are countries in the global south that have attempted to arrest individual soldiers. And I think that that's part of the question, the issue that goes to the leader's responsibility to the people. So I just wanted to add that.
And just to add.
Please,
Yeah.
This is really difficult. I'm not defending the Israeli government in any ways, but it's so easy to have an opinion. The whole of the world now are great experts on the Middle East. Everywhere I go, it's hard to be Israeli. It's certainly hard to be Jewish. And it's even harder to be a part of a system that I don't agree with. And it's not true that all of Israel is just waiting to destroy Gaza. There are huge demonstrations. I wish I saw the same demonstrations against Trump here. But I'm not looking to compare suffering. I'm looking to understand how the hell this all happened. And it's 77 years of occupation. It didn't start on the 7th of October. However, on the 7th of October, Israel lost a war. This is the first time that this Okale, I can do everything, army lost. What happens to you when you lose a war? You become extremely humiliated, especially the men who served in the Israeli army. They couldn't rescue the hostages, like the whole Entebbe heroic act, which was also contributes to this sense of humiliation. And lots of the revenge and the ugly behavior that happened in Gaza, which happens in the West Bank as well, comes out of this feeling. We're going to show them, let's blow up with beepers and all of the stuff that they did in Lebanon. But also, I talk about accountability. For me, in the West Bank is far more serious. Because here the settlers are running rampant, doing exactly what they want with no accountability, with sometimes encouragement from the Israeli army. Please, for 1 minute, don't think that all the Israelis are sitting at home and joyfully rejoicing what is happening. It is heartbreaking. There is so much fear which is also creating the anger and the trauma on both sides. This isn't a black and white situation. There are so many nuances going on and so many very deep looking into what have we done and how can we get out of this and how will it end. You can't imagine, I live in Jaffa and there were rockets one after the other outside my house. So I'm quite pleased there was the Iron Dome, otherwise I wouldn't be here. So this is not also, there should not be all the weapons, but I can tell you weapons of protection, and I wish to God that everyone had those Iron Domes, because it can be a very traumatic thing. If you will make a noise, I will jump. Okay, so that's what's going on in Israel and Palestine. And yet, with all of this horror that is going on, I also look at the people, the Palestinians and the Israelis in our organization, who have remained. We have lost 3 families out of 800 from the parents of, I don't mean lost, they died, I mean they lived. And we've had 80 new members. And that's very important, member families. And so there is hope. And I wish for the students, if you would really look into the organizations in Israel and in Palestine that are working to end this, if you want to be of help, you can start to support any of the organizations breaking the silence who are the most important for a future reconciliation process. The Palestinian prisoners will be their partners in a reconciliation process. That's what has to happen. Support breaking the silence, Women Wage Peace, one of the Palestinian NGOs, Combatants for Peace, the Parents Circle. So many of these organizations, when you talk about lonely, when I wrote to an op-ed to say, free the man who killed David if it will bring back a hostage, you can't imagine the ugly feedbacks and talkbacks that I got. So, it's hard for me to listen to all of this. Of course it's hard for me. It's not that I don't know the truth behind. But I also know that there are thousands and thousands and thousands of Israelis who get up and go every day to the hostage center to demonstrate against the government. There are not enough demonstrations against the occupation, which should be happening. But instead of all the time just being in the critical mode, try to find a way that will make a difference in Sima's life and in my life.
Thank you so much for this, and I can't even imagine how hard it is for you to be sitting here talking about big issues while you have also like a personal loss. And that takes a lot of power. I just also want to recognize a couple of things, because this is a conversation. With regards to the Iron Dome, one thing you said is about October 7th. Oh, sorry. So, when I spoke to Israelis after October 7th, one of the biggest things they said is it was not just, the losses of lives and what happened. It was also the loss of the concept of deterrence of the side. That also adds, when we're talking about the Iron Dome and the arms and the support, October 7th did not happen because there was a lack of arms and weapons and defense system, if we can put it. It happened despite them. And this is the point that we keep saying, is more weapons does not mean more security. It means actually it increases insecurity. And I have personal friends on both sides who's got hostages. One of them died and one of them lived. And I've got many friends who died and are dying in Gaza. And I understand between people and loss and grievances on a human level, it's not black and white, but there's something that is black and white, that there is an occupier and an occupied, right? I was in Hebron in January, and you cannot be there and not see apartheid in front of you, experiencing it. Myself as I'm originally from Egypt, as an Arab, walking with the group I was walking with, I was terrified because as an Arab, I should not be allowed to walk in that street. There are like special streets that I have to walk in. I saw the houses that their doors are welded with people inside, and they have to jump across, like from the rooftop in order to be able to get in and out of their own houses. So there are things that it's just like I don't think they are issues of dispute. I mean, they are clear, and that does not take away from what I fully agree on the complexity.
I get it.
Yeah.
You went to Hebron. I went to Hebron with a group from our organization and the settlers through Stones Heads.
Yes.
So, okay, but we continue with the work. I can't only think that everything, neither side is going to disappear. And if you think about it, today there is a German ambassador in Tel Aviv, and there is an Israeli ambassador in Berlin. So miracles can actually happen.
I just want to comment on Israeli and Palestinian human rights organizations that I've been working with for over 20 years. And for those of us who work in Israel Palestine, we know that Israeli and Palestinian human rights groups have been the most incredible, brave activists. But it's not so easy that we should work with them and support them because Israel is criminalizing them and destroying them. They have designated the 6 leading Palestinian human rights organizations, including Al-Haq, which is one of our partners in the ICC submission, as terrorist organizations and made it illegal to communicate with them. The US government is about to designate them as terrorist organizations. There's new legislation in Israel that is criminalizing foreign funding for any of the Israeli groups, including Combatants for Peace, including Breaking the Silence, including Yesh Din. And so the reality we have to come to terms with is that civil society as we know it in Israel is being destroyed. And so it's not going to be so easy. And the other reality we have to contend with is that the majorities of Israel have elected the right-wing government, and poll after poll shows that they support the military actions in Gaza. And finally, I do think we have to grapple with the reality that no, it's not clear that Palestinians are going to be there because there's a genocide underway, because there is a plan adopted by the Trump administration to expel all Palestinians from Gaza into neighboring states. And that is the harbinger of what is coming for the West Bank. We are in a new reality of having to grapple with the fact that 10 years from now, there may be no more Palestinians in Gaza, and that is with the backing of the United States. So things are very, very different now.
Things are very different from whatever they were. And I cannot remember a worse time in Israel. But I also think that there is such a group of people wanting to end this. We were thrown out of schools. The parents so-called have been working in schools for something like 20 years. We were Palestinian and an Israeli from our group were going to a classroom of 17-year-olds on purpose because they were going to the army, and they actually never met. You would go into a classroom of 17-year-old kids and you'll say to them, who of you have ever met a Palestinian? Nobody. Who speaks Arabic? Maybe one in the class. Who's been overseas? The whole class, more or less. So the point is there's this major cutoff. And I can tell you about the summer camp kids. Every year we send children, we have a summer camp for Palestinian and Israeli kids, which the Israeli government deemed highly dangerous. I'm not joking. They actually had a debate in the Knesset, in Parliament, to decide whether we could have the summer camp or not. I'm talking about 14-year-old kids to 17, Palestinian and Israeli. The American embassy before Trump and the German embassy intervened, and we had the summer camp. And suddenly I recognized what happened. My grandson went to summer camp, all my grandchildren go, and he's highly spoiled. He's had everything in his life that you could desire. And he said to me, you know what? This was the best week I ever spent in my life. And I said, Why? I wanted to understand why. Because it alleviates the fear of the other, and that is when we begin to know, and that's the work that we can do. And so we sued the Ministry of Education because they kicked us out of schools. We won. But then again, it's starting out now. They don't want us to have the ceremony, and we've been to the High Court 3 years running. It's an uphill battle, and we need that kind of support. When you talk about lonely, I'm very lonely.
I'd like to, so we'll be pivoting to hearing from you guys in just a few moments, but I wanted to have just a quick sort of what I'm hearing here and move it forward a little bit. I think, here's something that is so obvious that it should go without saying, but I'll say it anyway. Both the United States and Israel are rapidly democratically backsliding countries whose administrations are doing what you do in the order that you do it when you don't want to have a democratic system anymore. We all know this. We see it here in this country. The difference is that Israel is also perpetrating, as we speak. I mean, the Israeli military and the Netanyahu administration, with a good deal of popular support, are committing ongoing atrocities while the United States remains supporting them. So I think that one of the things that I started off talking about was accountability. And we talked a little bit about legal accountability through international organizations with the idea that there was no legal accountability. We're not going to hold our breath on that through Israeli domestic criminal justice systems. We talked about we talked a little bit about political accountability that the Netanyahu, the government is accountable to its electorate, which has the final say so far as to whether it's in power or not. I want to follow up on maybe a third kind of accountability that I think that we're hearing about now, and that is the accountability through civil society institutions, and there's a reason why democratic backsliders target civil society institutions, a very good reason. And I wanted to ask if, just in the few minutes before we pivot over, if I could ask each of you to, Robbie's already very generously identified a bunch of civil society institutions that are trying to hold open a space for dialogue. And not surprisingly, are all being targeted with being shut down. The same thing's happening here in the United States. Can the three of you maybe just offer, if you don't mind, some examples of civil society institutions that you think can be stakeholders in trying to put domestic pressure on the Netanyahu government to conform to its legal obligations? And if so, how can we support these institutions? I'll ask Leila to start, please.
So obviously, for people who've been watching the news, there's a massive solidarity movement globally, and that took to the streets prior to the so-called ceasefire. And that's an example of pressure that states were feeling, that led to governments, reviewing and taking some action, small action, to withhold certain arm transfers. I think
Just think about this, the scale of the popular protests in the months leading up to October 7th over the Netanyahu's administration's attempt to capture the high courts.
I'm sorry, Robbie, but the primary civil society movement or public movement in Israel concerns Netanyahu's accountability to the Jewish state, to the Jewish people, to the Israeli people, and their ideological and their social contract with the state as protecting the Jews. They reporter after reporter who goes to these protests of the hostage families will say you do not see signs against the war in Gaza. You do not have the public objecting to what's happening. It's not, it's there. But anyway, the point, okay, what I want to talk about is the boycott, divestment, sanctions movement, which has had, which is the focus of a lot of the campus work in the US and Britain and around the world. I mean, South Africa also took this up with great support and at great risk to the country for various reasons. But the boycott, sanctions, divestment movement has been successful. But they are at risk right now because of US laws criminalizing work to fight for Palestinian rights under the language of anti-Semitism, and we have Jewish Voices for Peace, which has mobilized their membership to take great risks. And it must be extremely hard to do that. But they were protesting on Wall Street, they protested in the Trump Towers, and they've been arrested and they continue. So that's a sign of hope. And I think generationally, people are, Jewish Americans and others are moving towards a position of supporting human rights and the rule of law. So that's movement, that's progress. Harvard Law School passed a petition calling on Harvard to divest from Israel. There have been other schools that have been successful in passing this motion, which puts pressure on universities to consider this issue. Norway divested their pension, I believe, from Israeli companies. So there is movement along the boycott, sanctions, divestment movement. It is the movement that most Palestinians are getting behind. And it is, looking at the South African model or other models, there is hope that will be effective in mobilizing accountability of leaders and governments.
Maybe just two more quick comments on that before we open it up, if you like. Or we can just recognize.
Can I just say one thing?
Sure.
No, I'm for divestment, yes. If you invest that divesting money in something positive for peace.
You asked for recognizing like organizations to support, and there are many. Some of them, like you mentioned, breaking the silence, standing together. Those are all organizations, and in Palestine and help and others. I mean, and I can't be fair to just name names, and they're all people who are working with international organizations, taking huge risks. But the thing is, like, supporting those organizations is like sending like resources or publicly talking in their support is not enough to protect them. What protect them is we make sure that those in power have the integrity to stand against what's happening, both in Israel and I think the problem starts here in the United States, and it does not start with foreign policy. It starts with domestic policies, with politics, in money in politics, in corruption in campaigns. Because I mean, like just this week, Senator Bernie Sanders is like put on the resolution that like GRD is like the joint resolution of disapproval for sending arms to Israel, and it is like it's getting less support. I mean, like that is because of the fear of the representatives in Congress in the United States, because they're going to be primaried out, because there are powerful organizations associated with certain countries that make sure that the cost is high for anyone who stands against this. So unless we try to actually address this issue, it's very hard to just like do some patchwork on helping this organization. I'm not saying they're not mutually exclusive, but there should be an understanding like where the core of the problem is.
We'd love to have your comments.
I'm happy to just project it. We're gonna wire you up. Okay. Thanks so much for the discussion. I was really struck by the use of AI in the targeted strikes by the IDF.
Louder.
Stand up. And I guess one issue with AI is this like black box,
Really close to you.
black box phenomenon that just describes a total lack of transparency in how AI generates its recommendations. So do you think the use of AI in these kinds of efforts is intended to make holding accountable more difficult? Because it's not totally clear where these recommendations are coming from, who's responsible for them. And do you think that's a broader trend in prevention just generally?
Well, I mean, intentions aside, I mean, the fact is, I mean, it makes it very difficult to have accountability with the use of AI. It's extremely dangerous, but also, I mean, like, it's important to know, it's like, its use. I mean, so it's supposed to be used for precision, but right now it's being used for like actually having mass targets. And this is where, like, at least the beginning of accountability starts. The problem also with that, I mean, and also responsibility does not just sit with the one who just like press or clicks on that. It's the responsibility for the handful of corporations who have power over AI, its development, its sales, and where it goes. And this goes back again to the issue of oligarchy and the rise of those corporations into power in the United States.
Hi, hi, thank you so much, all of you, for all the work you're doing and all the different strategies that we need to end the genocide and an occupation. I wanted to ask about unarmed civilian protection and your thoughts on it. My understanding is there is a mission of around 100 unarmed civilian protectors that's going to the West Bank. And, you know, they do intervene with settlers and they document to try to help accountability and they try to protect there. But I, you know, would love thoughts on, is that effective, useful? Do we need more of it? Are there problems with it? I'd just love your thoughts.
Yeah, on unarmed civilian protectors, as I'm sure you know, a U.S. citizen was recently murdered trying to provide civilian protection in a settler rampage in the West Bank, and the U.S. government did absolutely nothing. We had just celebrated, or that's the wrong word, the anniversary of the murder of Rachel Corrie, another American citizen who was attempting to protect unarmed civilians in Gaza. And so it is an incredibly dangerous undertaking. First of all, because the Israeli military will shoot and kill you, regardless of your intentions and whether or not you're a threat, regardless of whether or not you're a U.S. citizen or non-Israeli. Second, they're making it very, very hard to even enter the West Bank. The same policies of closure that Israel has imposed on Gaza since 2006, making it not only virtually impossible for Gazans to get out, but for internationals to get in, That's now happening in the West Bank. And so it's a very important effort, but a very, very costly one and a very risky one. My son is considering going to Jerusalem this summer to help defend the Armenian quarter. I'm Armenian from attack and encroachment. I think it just might be too dangerous, and I may not be willing to let him go, even to the old city of Jerusalem, even to protect Armenian historic lands in the old quarter, in the old city.
There is an organization called B'Tselem, and that is Palestinians and Israelis who record atrocities in the West Bank. And in many cases, what they have recorded has been used as evidence. It's very difficult for a Palestinian to get justice for any crime committed against them. And so sometimes B'Tselem can help with actual evidence of photographs or videos.
Thank you very much. I'd like to live in a hope that I would one day see accountability. But we have seen over the past 1.5 years that the level of the atrocities have only raised and has not decreased. Do you think the idea of being held accountable one day, this idea that Israel will be held accountable one day, makes them fear, and that's why they're only increasing that atrocities over time, because they're like, okay, we're gonna be held accountable anyways, so let's just continue what we're doing and raise it.
If you look at yourself, how old are you? 18, 19? Maybe a little more, I don't know. When you look at kids who go to the army, firstly, they think they're invincible. And secondly, they are certainly not concerned with accountability. They are trained to do what they do. And unfortunately, I wish it was a more moral. Israel was once known as having the moral army. There are the most dreadful things happening. But there are also dreadful things happening from the Hamas. But I don't want to go into a comparison of suffering. All I can tell you is that the people who were killed and burned to death on the kibbutzim were mainly from the left. And that's sad. Really sad.
I'd like to tell a story,
Yeah,
if you don't mind. So I was, I led work on the refugee file under the Oslo period, right? And I did that for the Palestinian negotiators. And there were often small informal conversations, I call them track twos. And I was involved in one which was small and intimate. And I'm not Palestinian, I'm Syrian American, but it included Palestinians and Israeli Jews. And in that conversation, we were talking about the right of return, which is, which threatens, which would, if it were to happen in mass numbers of Palestinians came back, would undermine the possibility of a democratic Jewish state if it's still a democratic state. Anyway, one of the Israelis said, personally, I will recognize the right of return if you recognize my existence and my attachment to the place and my ability to stay. And I was so profoundly moved by that conversation and that admission, because to me, it's only logical for Palestinians to make that recognition known, somehow as an opening. I have spoken to a number of Israeli audiences. This was before, I think it's society has changed, but on the issue of what happened in 1948 and the refugee return, there is a lot of curiosity amongst Israelis to understand the history, to understand what happened. And I think there is fear. We've talked about it in other cases. Where recognizing the fear of the other is important. And I was always of the opinion that that could move and progress. I don't know if it's possible right now because the extremism, I certainly think it would be very hard to ask Palestinians that are going through a genocide to recognize Israeli rights to stay and Israeli fears. And I think the Israeli public is not in an opinion to recognize the Palestinian rights. So I really fear that we've moved beyond that moment of being able to do that kind of mutual recognition. But I do think that at least at one point it could have moved the process forward. But the peace process has never been about accountability. It's always been about compromising on the issue of land and on the issue of separating Israelis and Palestinians along the 1967 borders. But that incident will always stay with me as a way forward. And I hope someday, with the generational change, particularly amongst American Jews, that we will get to a point where that kind of mutual recognition will be possible.
Hi, and is this working well? Hi, thank you for all being here today and sharing your expertise. And I admit that my question has shifted 5 times in the last 2 minutes.
Well, you have to look up.
I have to talk up, or is that better? Okay. I admit that my question has changed a lot more in the last 2 minutes than what I thought it would. But I also want to make a comment about accountability in terms of, regardless of how long the ICC has existed for, this conflict has been going on for at least 70 years, and it's going to continue going on. And while I want to be optimistic as a soon-to-be graduate of this program about accountability, seeing where American society is going, even among the Jewish groups that I interact with and the Jewish friends that I have who I went to Birthright with, knowing that Israel would give us a lot of propaganda about what their beliefs are and how to align American Jews with those beliefs, I am not optimistic. At the same time, I also recognize where there are a lot of activists within the BDS movement who are not a part of it online, who are already speaking about doing informal militant-based accountability of taking the soldiers who might be on vacation, kidnapping them, and bringing them to the ICC personally. So there are already whispers of, if these official systems don't work, what the hell are we left with to work with? And while I don't want that to be the direction that some activists go in, it may be the case. And I wanted to partially ask you all for your reaction to that, but then to also point out, I do want to agree and invest in what you're suggesting of there needs to be more cultural connection between Israelis and Palestinians to make sure that both peoples can recognize where they're not different as much as they think they are, but they're actually very similar traumas, similar history, and similar belief. But I'm not sure if we can, I hope we can go towards that process, but I don't think the world is heading towards that in a way where we can sustain it.
I find this particular discussion probably the most challenging of all over this last couple of days. So what I want to say was October the 7th. An opponent understands him and understands the psychology of its deep enemy. And it knows its push points and its weaknesses. And it knows that what it will do will bring about an erratic and toxic response, which then produces a juggernaut, which is almost impossible to ever stop. I think what I want to say in this is that there cannot be a victory and a defeat in the Middle East. There's got to be a means of a win-win. And surely the real revolution has to be within each of Israel and of Palestine, because Hamas are not good for the Gaza people, and neither is the Netanyahu government good for the Israeli people. So actually the focuses surely should not be across the wire, it actually should be internalized upon the revolution of change within each of those areas.
You know, when I was at Human Rights Watch, one of the things we did was to ban the use of the term both sides, because it is distorting, because it's counterfactual, and it suggests an equality of power, it suggests an equality of criminality, and does not recognize that we are in a situation of a criminal apartheid regime that is committing genocide with the full support and backing of the world's greatest superpower against a relatively defenseless population that has resorted to feeble terrorist attacks that, of course, have caused tremendous devastation on October 7, but the disproportionality of criminality, abuse, and conduct is just not comparable. That being said, I agree with you that there needs to be a new approach and a new way forward. And the book that I have forthcoming in October by University of California Press attempts to do just that, and it attempts to provide and present a plan that will replace the dead and failed Oslo process with a new plan that is focused on ending apartheid and occupation and building a rights-respecting state. I absolutely think it's possible, but it's not going to happen via Israel alone or via Palestine alone. It matters zero what the Palestinian people in Gaza think, what they want, what they hope for, whether they recognize Israel or don't recognize Israel, doesn't actually matter. They have absolutely no say. And so it will take an effort of international accountability, international sanctions, international pressure, and an understanding among the Israeli society that they will not live in peace and security, because there will be continual resistance, some of it ugly, violent, and terrorist, so long as occupation and apartheid continues, if the mass expulsion plan that we're now facing fails. I think that can be the basis for a new understanding that respects the human rights of everyone between the river and the sea, Jews, Palestinians, Armenians alike. But I think it's very important to speak with the facts that are focused and centered on the power dynamics, the power structure, and the existing factual evidence of the atrocities that are underway.
Can I just say, sorry, I appreciate what you're saying, but I don't hear enough said about Hamas not being good for the people of that particular region. They're not good for the people of the region. Yeah. And the hopes that they would have.
Are you Palestinian?
Hamas.
Are you Palestinian?
Well, no, I think you know he's not Palestinian, actually.
I want to respond to your question about optimism, and I think with the state of the world right now, being optimistic is almost rude. It's like the question of like, how are you doing right now? This is like very offensive, particularly if you're asking people who are directly impacted by what happened. But there are reasons to think that there is a way. First of all, I mean, like I started my talk about like all the different ingredients that we need to have in order to have accountability. And I mentioned why they don't exist. But actually there are other indications that there is, that gives us hope only if we like pursue this angle. First of all, the act of accountability of someone would be like serving a sentence or having, I mean, some kind of consequence to them is the very end step of a long process that takes so many people in so many different ways and forms and shapes. For example, I mean, like if you see, it was like what happened with the ICJ, even though it does not have a direct impact, it means a lot to see like several countries getting together and having like this kind of at least, I mean, political statement in order to do that. This is one. This would not have happened. I mean, a few years ago. I'm not going to say decades ago. Second, like the ICC as well. I mean, it's like issuing warranties like both for Hamas and for Netanyahu. This is also significant. Having the word ethnic cleansing become a known word in the public domain, with many countries uttering it and many people in the public speaking of it, was not even conceivable, I mean, a few years ago. Having people understanding like what the Lehi laws are, understanding particular, I mean, laws and articles that appears in like CNN and it's just like the mainstream media, this is something. And I want to say, I mean, it's just like you all being here is part of the accountability. Because, I mean, yes, we're not taking a bullet, but we're taking a huge risk. You are all taking a huge risk. This is live stream. And we know that there are people who are ready to have like some cost for just that. But as you were like referring to the young woman who's like 20 years old and she's here, I mean, I cannot just, I mean, underscore how powerful it is for you to be here. And the evidence on that is that there are entire countries with their lobby group are trying to make sure that you're not, that you don't have the right to criminalize just the act of being in a space that they can name it like anti-Semitic or whatever labeling that would make this hard and fearful to be here. So this here, and thank you, Max, for just, again, like for having this conference and allowing us to do this and having it live stream. This is, you are putting yourself at risk. Accountability happens as a cost and a risk, and it doesn't have to be like taking a bullet for it. But there are different ways that it takes to it, and this gives me an optimism, especially we're seeing this like young students on a Saturday morning spending their time sitting to discuss such a heavy.
Thank you for that. So we have just a few minutes left. I'd like to collect two quick questions, one here and one here, and then maybe we can have just a few minutes to kind of respond.
I don't really like that.
Okay. Well, yeah. This yeah. This one you got.
The mic is shaky.
You have to almost do this.
So I'd like, is it working?
Yeah.
Yeah. So I'd like your opinions about education.
Yeah.
I'm really interested in, Robbie and I were talking yesterday about being complicit in systems, right? That we're all sort of part of these systems of oppression and systems of complicity where choices are declining. So one of you pointed out that this didn't start with the Trump administration, right? I think everyone here probably is very fearful of what's happening in the United States. Obviously, Palestinians are very fearful, and at least many Jews in Israel are very fearful. I'd like to know what your recommendation is for educating young people, socializing children in an era of declining choices. And to me, that seems like that applies to all three actors, right? The choices in Israel are bad. The choices in Palestine are bad. The choices in the United States are bad. How do we teach that to young people? What do we tell them? How do we tell them to respond to that?
I'll just speak from the US angle. Unfortunately, even as educators, your work has to be political because laws have been passed that will severely impinge on and restrict your ability to teach the facts and the history about Israel-Palestine under the guise not only of anti-Semitism and the so-called Anti-Semitism Awareness Act, which literally describing Israel as an apartheid state as anti-Semitic. That legislation, that effort to curtail academic freedom, the reason why we've seen Middle East Studies centers at Columbia shut down, the reason why the heads of the Middle East Studies Center at Harvard were summarily fired, the reason why Trump is imposing these conditions on universities is because they do not want American educators to teach about Israel-Palestine in a way that is factual and truthful. And so educators' work must be political work to protect academic freedom, to protect academic independence, to protect the ability of experts to teach the facts and knowledge to your students. I think it's terrifying that that's happening because sure, they'll start with Israel-Palestine, but next we're not going to be allowed to teach about climate change. And after that, we're not going to teach about gun violence or abortion and reproductive health and reproductive rights. This is the Trojan horse that will end academic freedom in the United States. So as educators, I think your work has to be political and to fight this kind of legislative action by our own government.
We run a flag program at the Parent Circle. It's a parallel narrative program. So what it is we bring Palestinians and Israelis usually from the same profession because they need to do something afterwards. They need something in common. And the parallel narrative is the story of both sides. We would take, it's usually about 30 people. We would then go to the Holocaust Museum. Most Palestinians have no idea about the Holocaust. And then we would go to a village which exists in Israel, which was once Palestinian the next day. And I remember going with a mother that came from that area. She belonged to our group, and she looked down and she started to cry. And she said, "This is the well that I drew water out of as a child." And then she was wearing a key to a door that won't open, but you could listen and learn with empathy. The next part of the course is to take two professors, one Palestinian, one Israeli, to tell us the milestones of our history. So 48, 67, 73, the Intifada, all of the wars that have happened since the uprising. That's another parallel universe, but that's a lesson in learning to listen with empathy, even if you don't agree. We have more than about 3,000 graduates from this course. And as soon as the closure is over, we'll go on with it because it's very valuable.
Just curious, can I ask a question?
Well, we're actually at time, so we could.
Oh, that's fine.
So yeah, we'll thank you all for listening with empathy as well. I really appreciate it, and please join me in thanking our panelists.